Tonight, we look forward to an engaging, spontaneous discussion between scholar, critic, and curator John Carlin and Art Spiegelman, Pulitzer Prize-winning creator of Mouse and co-founder of Raw magazine. Please join me in welcoming John Carlin and Art Spiegelman.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for coming.
So I would say the exhibition that was just introduced, hopefully most of you have seen, really is the result of literally of a conversation that Art and I have had over about 20 years. I met Art around 1983 when I was curating an exhibition at the Whitney Museum called the Comic Art Show, which was about the relationship of comics and fine art. It was done at the height of what was at the time called the East Village scene, and there were a lot of artists who were using comics in their work, and it really interested me. And I was kind of a young, smart-ass character. Now I'm just an old, smart-ass character. And Art graciously invited me in and started essentially the lifelong teaching of how to read a comic that his work as an artist and as a editor and critic of comics really has done for, I think, generations of people.
And it's amazing this conversation has gone on so long because he's allergic to my cigarettes.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember the very first time I met Art going into his studio. It was a little further south on Green Street than it is now. And being somewhat intimidated and completely traumatized by him pulling out this amazing comic strip, which is in the exhibition, that is essentially about his reaction to his mother's suicide, which is now part of Mouse. Mm-hmm. And it was really one of the hardest things one could imagine, that here you're sort of bearing your soul in this work and, sort of seeing it, having it read to me, and then like, well, how do you respond to something like that? Like,
sorry about your mom, Art.
Right. What do you say? But the thing that was amazing, because at the time I was actually a graduate student at Yale. This was the height of deconstruction. I had really been trained to look at conceptual art, sort of Marcel Duchamp and his children. And the thing that really flipped me about doing this show, I really came at it from the art side, was that the cartoonists, notably Art, but also Gary Panner and Suko and a number of other people I met then, they just knocked me out. And it really was like, these people are real artists. They draw, their attention to craft is just amazing. And the beginning of the conversation, which manifested itself in this exhibition, was really literally Art using his work and his verbally to help people understand how to read his own medium. And one of the things that struck me was, like many great artists have to teach you how to read their own work. That's part of, Velázquez, Shakespeare. There's a sense that they have to help you in. So one of the ways I thought start this conversation tonight is to talk a little bit about the idea of memoir and truthfulness, a topic that's been in the news.
But considering the State of the Union, we should talk about truthiness tonight.
Exactly. So we're assuming that there aren't that many Bush fans in the audience tonight.
Memoir. Well, to start talking about this, it's to start talking about a master that wasn't in the show, which is Justin Green. Because what happened really was, in this underground comics moment that I was part of, all kinds of new subject matter were opened up. I think they boiled down to mainly sex and drugs, but a lot happened with Zap Comics in the period around that was making it okay for comics not to have punchlines, to make a comics for comics' sake somehow, that didn't have to deliver a newspaper audience every day and get them to come back to find out what happened to Terry the day after. And one of the areas, besides the taboo breaking, was a book by Justin Green called Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary, and as he says on the back cover, must reading for neurotics of all creeds. And although it still used the cipher of a changed name, Justin Green, Binky Brown, it was basically about his own obsessive-compulsive tendencies and the psychosexual guilt that came with growing up Catholic. And it was an eye-opener for Crumb, among other people. He attributes the autobiographical impulse that then that he took on to Justin. Justin attributes it to Crumb for one panel that Robert did to introduce head comics. But nevertheless, Justin really opened up territory of turning comic book panels into confession booths. And recently, as I've been thinking back over my work while working on a memoir that is, Pantheon is going to republish my very first book of comics from the 70s called Breakdowns, which came out in a very limited edition. It was very pared down, the work I could tolerate after having done it and wanted to put together into a book. And when they're putting it out, I realized I had to make an introduction, and so I started drawing the introduction rather than writing it, and I now looks like I will have a 50-page introduction to a 40-page book. And in the course of thinking back over these strips, I started thinking about Justin a lot, because Justin really moved my work around in many ways. And the book Breakdowns was called From Mouse to Now, now being 1978, and Mouse being a 3-page comic strip I did for an underground comic called Funny Aminals that had a lead story and cover by Robert Crumb, which was two little, I think, cats or foxes who tracked down a chicken woman with a very large butt, and it looks like they want to screw her, but basically they eat her at the end. So that was the same book that had the first, what became Mouse 20 years later, I guess.
Which is in the exhibition over at MoCA.
That's right. Yeah, the
three-page
three-page
story.
version of Mouse is in the show. So anyway, Justin was the editor of that book and had invited me to do something for it. And at some point I was going to chicken out. I just had no good, I'm trying to figure out if this is somehow related to the Crumb strip. No, okay. I was going to chicken out. I was just going to say, I'm bailing. I don't have any good ideas. And in order to inspire me, Justin sent me 3 tabs of speed taped to a drawing that I still have in my files somewhere, saying, you got to come through. We're counting on you for these 3 pages. And I still have the speed if anybody wants to make an offer. But essentially, this was like him prodding me to do something. And it was right in the wake of the beginnings of his autobiographical experiments. And I think it allowed me to move from where I was going, where the only requirement for this book, beside it being 3 pages, is that it use anthropomorphic characters. And I was moving toward doing some kind of EC horror story with mice and mouse traps and make it seem like what at the time seemed still a fresh idea of like genre blending between funny animal and horror comic. And then was sitting in on a film class by my friend and mentor, Ken Jacobs, who was showing a bunch of racist cartoons and a bunch of early Terry-toons. And the difference between the frolicking mice and the frolicking pickaninnies was 0. And at that point, this epiphany hit, which is Al Jolson is just Mickey Mouse with ears. And then I thought, I have it. I've got it. I'll do a comic strip about the Ku Klux Cats and blacks in America. And I was often running for about 48 hours before I realized that whatever I do, I'm either going to come off as a racist or as some kind of liberal simp, but I'm not going to be able to really dig in. And that's when somehow the synapses crossed and I began working on what eventually became Mouse. I think it was like Kafka's Josephine, the singer, or the Mouse Folks story that started whispering to me and made the connection. But at the time that I was doing Mouse, it was the 3-page Mouse. That was partially because I wanted to tell a story, and it was a story that just wasn't as known as now. I mean, now there's an entire holokitsch industry that just wasn't in place in 1971 when I did that thing. So that was my first autobiographical strip and breakdowns. And the second one was the one you were referring to, the Prisoner on the Hell Planet. And that was actually done at in the same room that Justin had done Binky Brown a year or so earlier, because when he moved out, I'd moved to San Francisco and moved into his studio and took over his apartment. And the only advice he had for me was, make sure you face the drawing table this way and not that way, because if you face it that way, it aims directly at the Mission Dolores Church, which will interfere with the work. And so he was an important catalyst for this area for me. And I would say that after those strips, I was moving more and more towards something else, which was not so much memoir as the other thing you were talking about, which is how to read a comic strip. I was just interested myself in what this language was, partially inspired by the non-narrative independent filmmakers. I've mentioned Ken Jacobs, but like Stan Brakhage, maybe you'd know, or
Well, talk about the lecture you gave at the Filmmakers Co-op. Is that around?
that was after I came back to New York. That's later. Well, that was the first time I seriously wanted to give a crash course in comics, and it was something called the, Steve, you're here, what's it called? No, but what was the place called? The Collective. The Collective for Living Cinema. I got invited to do a series of seminars there, and I just began making slides of all of those books that came tumbling down on you when you came to talk to me about comics. And
So what work had you done up to that point?
well, as a lecturer, as a cartoonist?
As a cartoonist, I mean, before the lecture.
Oh, okay.
I'm just trying to place it in your career.
Well, back in, I was sort of up to 1972. It's going to be a long evening, but I think somewhere around then, I began to poke at the implications of these filmmakers who were looking at the stuff of film, like what is this celluloid that light's passing through? And somehow, for someone who really was coming from somewhere else, like my culture was comics culture, everything I knew I learned from comic books. You know, like learning how to read in order to understand if Batman was a good guy or a bad guy, learning about sex from Betty and Veronica and about feminism from Little Lulu and so on. I wasn't coming like you were from a world of deconstruction, postmodern painting, and Duchamp and his kids. That was a world I was introduced to primarily through these filmmakers who were looking at film as an extension of the visual plastic arts rather than the theatrical arts. And it made me reanalyze the stuff that was making up my comics. And so a lot of the rest of the work that was in breakdowns, and some of which is in this show, like a page called Don't Get Around Much Anymore, which really deals with what the words are giving you, what the pictures are giving you, how they move you into different places, and how the time isn't really like a storyboard. In a comic strip, time is something else, you know? Those things, like another comic strip called Ace Hole, were really trying to work out the stuff of comics. Now, the stuff of comics, of course, is primarily narrative, even more so in its essential nature than film. You know, like it's possible to see a Stan Brakhage movie of close-ups of cigarettes burning in an ashtray for whatever it is, an hour or two, or, but it's really hard to chop narrative off of comics because you're just left with drawing. It's another discipline.
Well, that's one thing that always interests me, is that both of those tendencies seem to be a drive to truth. The truth about self-expression, autobiography, and the truth about form. That this sort of idea that you're going to get at the essence in each of those.
Yeah, and to me it's really connected. You know, like the Prison on the Hell Planet strip was as much an exercise in form as it was in content. I mean, just moving toward a visual surface that was hearkening back to the German expressionists so specifically and overtly wasn't part of the mix in the underground comics that I was appearing for the most part. And the ways those pages were broken down weren't for the just part of an emotional role. They were really working back to see what was worth placing.
Talk a little bit about the technique and how you did that, because I think that's...
That's the Hell Planet. It was done on scratchboard. It's the poor and lazy man's way of making woodcuts, because it's just a thin coating of clay and you can scrape into it and make it look like a woodcut. It worked well for me as a medium because I just can't do what some, you know, I'm the most retarded master in this show. Like I don't draw like a dream like most of these other people do. And so everything is a kind of, actually what it's like is, did any of you see a movie called Bucket of Blood? Roger Corman. There's this thing, I think it's that movie. It's one where there's this guy who works like a Maynard G. Krebs guy sweeping up a coffee house, and he realizes if he wants to get the chicks, he's going to have to become an artiste of some kind, and he can't do it. So there's one scene near the beginning of the movie where he's got this giant slab of marble and he's trying to be a sculptor, and he's got this chisel, and I really identify with the guy in this scene. He's going, be a nose, be a nose, be a nose. It then leads into him throwing the chisel through a wall. It kills a cat who falls into a... that's a whole other movie that takes place. But that be a nose thing, scratchboard is a great medium to make it be a nose because you can work back and forth. You can work white on black and then black on white and then white on black again. And it doesn't look like the the total mess that you get when you start putting paste-ups of other pieces of paper and white paint on top of the page.
I always thought it was interesting, maybe just forcing the point that, here's this strip which is very emotional, kind of an emotional breakthrough. And the fact that it's scratched, that there's something physical and, that it wasn't, it's not, a brush, it's not.
Yeah, I'd say more, maybe the word is carved. Like everything that gets done, including the mouse drawings that made up that book that most people know me for. It looks like they're just doodles. They look very spontaneous. They're so not spontaneous, those drawings. There's sometimes 30 or 40 versions and sketches for each one of the little boxes. And after a certain point, when I began to understand what I was making, I realized that each of these pictures had to function as a linguistic unit even. It wasn't just a gestural drawing. And in the Prisoner on the Hell Planet, in a way that's more visible because it's carved, it's placed so firmly. When working on Maus, I actually, early on, when I was still interviewing my father and beginning to take notes and figure out how to make the breakdowns just by doodling them out very quickly, I had no idea what the visual surface would be. And I would say, more for me than any of the other artists in the show, since I have no really natural visual style, each work has been built on some ideas of what should this look like? What kinds of work should I be channeling to make it happen? The German Expressionists being case in point for the Hell Planet strip. And when working on Maus, I didn't know what I would draw this like. I just knew that I was going to make this long work. It was a vow I made when I turned 30 that I would, because I was supposed to be dead in a motorcycle accident by 30, the way I figured it, and by 30 I hadn't even learned how to ride a motorcycle. And so it's all part of that generation that wasn't able to trust anybody over 30. So I figured if I was going to stay alive, I had to take on some work worth the task, and that was going to be this long comic book story. And so I knew I was working on it, but I didn't know what it would look like. So I kept doing these different kinds of graphic research, and there's one scrap that still exists that's a full page of Maus with the same panel structure that I eventually used, but it was all drawn looking like Prisoner on the Hell Planet as kind of scratchboard drawings. And for a number of reasons, I scrapped that, even though it was no less work to do it the way I did do it, panel for panel. But the Prisoner on the Hell Planet look would have insisted on a kind of visual authority. Like, I could make it look imposing. And that would mean, like, putting myself in a different relationship to whoever might be looking at this later. Like it would be, I can draw, you can't, so just shut up and I'm going to talk. And the way I wanted Maus to be was much more intimate. And so it had to look like those first sketches, ultimately, is what I came to. But taking those first sketches, draining them of certain aspects of the gestural and the handwritingness of it, where it could look more glib, let's say, and instead would have the combination of being like a doodle and also like a blueprint, like needing both.
But going through one of the real privileges of doing the show was going through all the sketches many of the sketches that evolved into the deceptively simple looking finished Maus pages. And one thing that struck me was this, real drive to accuracy, that there is all this historical research in there. This is what the shoes look like. This is what the chimney looked like in the camp, the barracks, the bunks, that they're, sort of this technique or inventiveness on a formal level, but just this drive for accuracy.
Yeah, there is I gave myself the out of, it's just mice. By having the masks, I was able to get something wrong. But that would only be by default. It wasn't sort of like the James Fry approach to accuracy. So the goal was to get it right, and that meant a lot of scraping around for information at a time where it was much harder to come by than it's become since. I really ended up envying Spielberg's resources, if not his movie. When I went back the second time to Poland and ended up at Birkenau, the second time I went back there, there was this barrack, and I hadn't noticed it the first time. It was great. It was just what I needed to draw. Well, it turns out that it was built by Spielberg, and they had left it up. You know, they said, well, it's better than the ones we've got. They've all fallen down. His is still here. Getting the information was very, very difficult. And like, I really needed it because like when my father would say something like, I went down the street, I pictured 14th Street, you know? And it wasn't like that in Shradula, you know? So, yeah, there was a lot of having to like ingest and learn what things might be and make the most accurate projection possible. The person who's a master of this now is Joe Sacco, who has done some work he has one book called Palestine, another one called Garage, and he just last week had something in The Guardian about Iraq, an 8-page strip, where he's really doing his homework and making a very dry and very convincing schematic, but a very detailed one of what these things must have looked like, that projection outward. And it's a very specific kind of journalistic comics making that in some ways is all fabricated. I mean, he doesn't have a good sense of what the torture chamber looked like that he's describing in the comic strip about Iraqi torture, but it feels right. You know, like he obviously hasn't just said, well, I don't know, it'll have like an iron lady in it or something, you know.
But I think that's what
Iraq.
I thought was an interesting conversation to have right now, is we are in this weird point in our society where, you know, fiction, documentary, everybody knows the documentary styles, whether it's Joe Sacco or something we see on television or a cinema verite film, is a construction. You know, Michael Moore's documentary is polemical. It has an agenda. It may be truthful. It may be an exaggeration of truth. And I guess you know, when in Joe's work where it is journalistic and there is this sense of he's describing something, you know, I wouldn't characterize your work as journalistic. It is in the autobiography, memoir. You know, and I think you and I have talked about this before, is this idea of how do you get to sort of an emotional or an essential truth as opposed to a journalistic fact. And the degree to which art, the technique of art, is a great tool to do that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a matter of like I mean, a lot of conversations have taken place recently about the Fry thing, you know. There's on one level on which you can't know anything, just because that's the nature of being alive and the way the brain circuits work. Then there's another, much closer to the surface level, where true or false, you know, you were here or you weren't here. That's relatively easy. And what I found was trying to find what I could find out that just was on that most basic level, what happened. And then trying to make that understandable and felt, which is what narration offers, without stretching the point, without turning it into something that would have, I referred to Holokitsch before, without having violins underneath it, you know, that would allow you to like get to something without going over the edge and pushing your point towards something else. That's where the truth really lies. And for me, that involved something that I didn't have the words for it until I saw some article written about me after Maus came out, where Lawrence Weschler described my work as achieving a crystalline ambiguity. And I really liked that, you know? That seemed about right. That's that good thing of like, you take it as far as you can, but you don't go further. And then giving it narrative shape was how to do that without violating the basic trust of that impulse. And as a result, even the works I was doing with the form of comics, they took narrative as a given, and I was trying to make stories, but I found myself much more interested in the nature of stories and how stories get told than in the characters I was making up. Like, whenever I've tried to make fiction, it's almost like playing tennis without a net. It's like in a hotel somewhere in Georgia. No, a motel in Miami. He sat by the phone. No, she was watching television. Like not knowing where it should actually land. And I know that novelists have a conviction of where it has to land. But I find as soon as I try to tell the truth, I'm fine at fiction. You know, if anything, I just then have to like make sure I'm actually dealing with something that happened, but giving it form.
Right. I mean, if you look at the Fry thing, you know, if it had turned out that your father had spent the war years in suburban New Jersey.
I'm
you know.
Presbyterian.
That probably would have changed the nature of it. But I think this is something that really fascinates me, is that there is this kind of core truthfulness, accuracy in the descriptive elements of your work, and the fiction, the art, gets displaced into the formal elements in which you refer to the metafiction of them. Which is, that's what I was alluding to before, which is another kind of revealing of truth. It's the sort of this Brechtian, I'm not going to delude you on any level, but then it creates a different form of craft.
I mean, one thing that's happening though as I get older is I'm understanding how fiction got invented. You just can't say things about the people you know without them getting incredibly upset. So like, I think this is what led to the first novels,
Well, you said your son now, he's reading your work because he's in it.
He's only willing to read the panels he's in, so I don't know how much narrative continuity he's getting.
So if we look back at some of the other artists in the show, because how you got to that point, I mean, I think there is this moment that you describe in the independent comics in the 60s, Justin Green and R. Crumb, where all of a sudden it's sort of you can do anything, and that creates its own parameters.
Yeah, but it's interesting how much every medium ends up like cannibalizing itself. It's what makes these two shows talk to each other so fully. There's millions of movies about making movies, or plays about making plays, and novels about writing novels. And similarly, somehow, comics is in a very tight conversation with itself, so that it just seems inevitable that what made Crumb so revolutionary was resuscitating Elsie Seeger and Basil Wolverton. That at that time those styles were in thorough eclipse. What was dominant at that moment really was the stuff that Charles Schulz represents, that less is more, stripped down, punchline oriented somehow comics. And Crumb's going back to this kind of scratchy, blue collar, bare light bulb, Bigfoot, sordid world of thimble theater was a kind of re-cementing the continuity of comics that had gotten broken. Broken in part by that comics code that entered in the 50s and stopped the dialogue from moving forward more naturally. And throughout, I would say, all of the comic artists in the second half of the show are reabsorbing and carrying forward conversations with earlier artists, So it becomes very clear in my No Towers pages, where I literally was kind of hypnotized by the early comic strips. It was like the only thing that offered succor after September 11th. So I was just like living with them, and then began to have the Katzenjammer Kids turn into the Tower Twins. The work of Chris Ware is so specifically talking to the Frank King stuff in the first part of the show, that's just an essential part of how this thing happens. And Frank King, in turn, is talking to Winsor McKay and reinforming that while casting a shadow forward.
To me, that's one of the defining characteristics of art, is that artists talk to each other across time. They swipe, they steal, they dialogue with each other. There's a kind of a knowingness that, differentiates it from, say, pure folk art or tribal art that exists outside of time.
Yeah, that sounds good, but in comics it's just called swiping. The thing, though, that is actually interesting to me is how this show both provides it and makes it invisible. Because the way this show started, in some ways was John's early Whitney show that evidently got Annie Philbin, the director, here to go, oh, maybe there's something to this comic stuff. And then what specifically got this particular ball rolling was I held a conclave in my studio in the 90s at some point, when the Museum of Modern Art had a show of Mao's, and then a couple of years later I get a call from the drawing division of the MoMA saying, we just realized we don't have any of your works except a couple of prints. We'd like to buy some of your comics. And I said, when I was doing that show, I vowed I would never sell you anything. And They said, why? And I said, because you don't know anything about comics. And I saw all this stuff in your basement that never comes up for air. And I figured the worst thing that could ever happen to an artist is to be in the basement of the Museum of Modern Art. Not even one person would enjoy it, let alone in my medium where tens of thousands, if you're, might. And they did a double take on the phone and then said, but we have lots of comics. I said, yeah, what? And then I sent them back to make a list of what they had that's in the comics. And all they had was stuff that got stuck to the back of Toulouse-Lautrec's when they were being donated. So they had a Little King original, which is good, but not great. And then they had a Frank Giacoia Batman page, not even a great Batman page. And so it wasn't, and a total of maybe a dozen things. The only thing that was of any real worth was the drawings for the kinder kids, for the Feininger stuff. So they got back to me sheepishly, and they said, but we'd like to learn more about comics. And that set up this thing where I invited some curators to come, and I wanted to make a pitch, which was the world of the high arts has a lot to answer for having the MoMA High Art Low Culture show. And somebody has to offer redress for this thing, because this was a terrible thing. Like, it basically showed a painting by Lichtenstein and the rather indifferent comic strip panel that inspired that painting. Or when it did show a painter and a cartoonist together, you did it very well. You somehow didn't make the paintings dominate. And I don't even quite know how you did it, but in the...
Crystalline ambiguity.
That's it. You got there. Yeah, it's like, learn how to do that. The MoMA show did this thing where the paintings so totally eclipsed the comic strip art that even though they had George Harriman, not from their own collection because they didn't own one, but they had it hanging near some Miro's because they both used crescent moons or something. And basically what happened was the painting, as always, won the wall because paintings are made for the walls, and the comic won the catalog. It looked a lot better than the reproduction of the Miro painting. And the only way to get somebody to understand this stuff was to have a low show. So you just have, because if you just have comics on the walls, you get used to their imperfections, and you just look at them for what they are. If it's on a wall, you'll look. And so that was the pitch I was making, and as a result, I was going to give a kind of crash course in comics to the most uneducable group I ever could think of, which was museum curators. And I invited about 30 or 40 to my studio, and miraculously, people came. And among them was Annie, and at that time, running a place around the corner from me called the Drawing Center. And that was the pitch, and it sort of like, the main thing it led to immediately was was two curators from the MoMA walking from the museum in protest because they were told that there was no interest in such a show. Then I think the Whitney was actually considering it, but then everybody who was at my meeting left the Whitney in a huff, which they do every 2 years. I just didn't know about that cycle at the time. And anyway, so it took quite a long time before this thing got seeded. All of which was, a free associative way of getting back to my notion of the show originally wasn't as austere as what we ended up with. I don't think I could have pitched or would have been comfortable with being one of 15 masters, as if it somehow meant there weren't at least 70, 80, 100 masters. But what I was thinking of was something that had the historical elements of this show, but had more connective tissue, so that you might open up to show 15 or 20 pieces or so by one artist, but you wouldn't somehow come and see a Winsor McKay Nemo page without understanding what it meant to have these glorious Sunday supplements, which would have implied seeing at least one yellow kid before you got there. And then coming out of it, it might have been useful to see what actually by accident ends up being in the show, like a Bobby Make-Believe page by Frank King, the things that kind of fed from that and moved the conversation forward, or a George McManus page that was directly affected by McKay's work. And similarly, going into Crazy Cat, it would have been, in some ways, very useful to see some Mutt and Jeff. I mean, the style was one that was perfected by Harriman.
Well, to some degree, in the catalog, there's a tad, and
The
there's
catalog
a
does
couple of
some of
those
this,
things.
that's true.
And I think, yeah, the show should have had more connective tissues.
It would have taken the pressure off, because I suspect that a lot of the debate that's gone on around this show has to do with the horrors that come with canonization. You know, if this guy's in the club, that means somebody else isn't in the club. And the only real way to do that is to have 15 more masters next year, you know.
Well, I think part of the idea was really to say, okay, how do you create a canon? And ultimately, that's a bad thing, but it's sort of the place
No, you
to
need
start.
it. You need a canon, because otherwise there's nothing to rebel against. There
Right,
is such a thing, there is such a thing as a grid that you want to have, otherwise you're in that postmodern universe of it's all good,
Right.
or it's all bad, depending on which postmodernist you're talking to. But it's necessary to have some sense of accomplishment, and this show does that. But it's at the expense of understanding some of the continuity that allowed one master to become an influence on another.
So a year or so later, who are some of the people you most regret that aren't in the show?
Okay, it gets really hard when we talk about contemporaries, which is why I wanted nothing to do with curating
Okay,
this thing.
so-
That's your gig. But
so
I'll ask you that question in about 30 seconds. With the older artists, it's easier. Like my biggest regret at the moment is a cartoonist named Milt Gross. He's the most obvious artist who's in the same league as all of the people shown, or maybe greater than some. I don't have that much use for a couple of the masters out of the 15. But Milt Gross was an absolute genius at comics, and is somehow not, it's hard to talk about Winsor McCay and even George Harriman as really being known entities, but insofar as they are, Milt Gross is pretty much lost to a coterie of admirers, but his drawings have a kind of doodle quality that I keep aspiring to and can't get at, even after the 200th draft. I don't know why my things don't look like spontaneous doodles after 200 drafts, but he had this great handwriting, this kind of visual handwriting where it was like, yeah, I got to go knock off so I can get to the Friars Club by 1, and I've got to do a Sunday page. So it has that kind of breeziness. It's just he has a kind of Zen master spontaneity to his drawing, and he also has a number of great linguistic qualities. So he also became quite known for his Yiddish dialect stories and poems. And his panel breakdowns were incredibly inventive, and he was a big influence on the master that was probably the most responsible for me becoming a comics artist, which is Harvey Kurtzman. So I really would have loved to see that. Who would you put in? And even if you don't have to say who you'd take out.
Well, I think the thing that was interesting to me as I got deeper and deeper into this field was the breadth and the depth of it. So that in the sense that we did have these sort of 15 characters, the thing that really impressed me was how deep the bench was, whether it was Milt Gross or Rube Goldberg or Al Capp, that there are just so many interesting artists working in this field that it was a kind of overwhelming. I mean, my deepest regrets are actually contemporaries.
No, that's why I didn't want to be the one to talk about
So
the
I most regret that Charles Burns and Dan Klaus aren't in the show. Those are the ones that really kind of
they're
pain me
conspicuous
in
by
a
their
certain
absence.
way.
But
Just
then
because
the Hernandez brothers,
Yeah.
there's many contenders.
But I think that was part of what we meant to be provocative in doing, was to say, well, you could just keep going. There are hundreds of people who, depending on what angle you come in from, could be masters. I regretted leaving Patrick McDonald out, because I think working within the traditional newspaper tradition, he's kind of revived it and created something remarkable about it.
Yeah, I would say that what is true about each of the artists in the show is each of them had to reinvent what it meant to make comics, to co-mix words and pictures. They each invented a separate zone for that to be in. So one of the people I regret not seeing, more than Patrick McDonald even, who is a wonderful cartoonist, is Jules Pfeiffer. Not that it's so visually exciting, but it really changed what one thought might be a comic. Because you see, each person has to work around their strengths and weaknesses, so that for Milton Caniff, the strengths were this kind of very natural draftsman, a visual powerhouse, had a good sense of movement and understood movies, but man, his stories really suck. And on the other hand, Jules was a playwright, and a very concise one, and invented a way to put these words and pictures together to make that happen, and one can see the ripple effect of it. Very few of the people in this show didn't create a ripple effect. In the case of Feininger, it took decades and decades for that ripple to happen, but now it would be clear that, say, Mark Beyer and other artists owe a debt to Feininger. But with Pfeiffer, it really happened quickly, so that like, I think Gary Trudeau's work wouldn't be possible without Jules's work. And in a way, it's a precursor to the Justin Green thing I was talking about. Like, it's hard to find a real autobiography in comics before Justin, but certainly Bernard Mergendiler would seem to come close. And it's the flip side of the Schultz part of the show, The sanitized Protestant Mergendiler is Charlie Brown, and they're both coming from, in this minimalist, less is more cartooning post-war moment, informed by psychoanalysis, and they are each doing it in such different ways, and the tributaries are really interesting. Like, I would say it's easier to see how Crumb grows out of Pfeiffer than to see how Crumb might grow out of Schultz. I don't think he had any use for Peanuts.
Well, one thing that you said to me recently, or said in passing, that really struck me as a way to kind of giving some closure, is that every morning when you wake up, you have to decide which way you're going to draw that day.
Oh, it starts earlier than that. It's like, okay, Art Spiegelman, 27 Green Street. 50, I have to give myself my CV just so I remember who I'm supposed to be that day.
Because I think part of the ripple effect that your work helped create was the sense, almost everybody that comes before you in comics, other than Harvey Kurtzman, let's just say, really works within, finds a voice, or that voice evolves in a naturalistic, organic way over time, but they're not drawing in multiple styles simultaneously.
Well, even Kurtzman had one basic way he was drawing. He just had the advantage of having very skilled hands.
Exactly.
He had like Will Elder on the one hand and Wally Wood on the other to as the ventriloquist dummy for whatever he needed to say. But he was certainly an influence in the sense of, like, it wasn't about characters having little thimble theater-like dramas with each other.
But
I would say that the artist that was an influence is somebody else who one could consider for another cluster of 15, which is Bernard Krigstein. Because Bernard Krigstein, who is more comics illustrator than a cartoonist who wrote his own material, very specifically took on different chameleon-like guises. So in one EC horror story, he's doing his best to channel Japanese woodcut inflected art, and another one it's Caligari. So looking at that made it seem like, oh yes, of course, the style is part of the content in that sense, and it really should affect it rather than everything should come out as made of the same chopped meat, So I would say though that like that thing of like really analyzing the formal stuff, which like for me has its roots in certainly Kurtzman, is something that I was able to bring to the table.
But I think the idea that, because I see this very much, certainly in Chris Ware's work, is this idea that there are a multiplicity of techniques and styles that are available, and they're each one suitable to different types of expression, and then ultimately it's synthesizing them into a whole. So that in Mouse, there's probably the most consistent.
It was torture. I vowed I would never do it again, because the thing was, what looks like that natural style was like really hard won, and for the occasion. And somewhere into year 9 of this project, I think, it was like I was looking back at earlier work so I could forge that guy's drawings. I just had no idea how he had done it. And one of the problems was, like, in Mouse, I'd learned to draw small because I didn't want the advantages of some of you may have been surprised to see how big original comic art is compared to the printed result. It's a way of achieving a certain kind of relative perfection by minimizing the flaws. When it reduces, it's not as wobbly. And it's great for that industrial kind of art, but it certainly wasn't what I wanted for Mouse, where the intimacy was important. So I had to work same size as printed, so that A, there'd be no extraneous detail, and B, my inabilities would show. The wobbliness of the line was part of it, and I guess like by year 9, I'd learned to draw small. So if I had gone on a few more years, I would have had to draw small and blow it up to get the same effect.
Well, earlier, at the beginning of our talk, I said something about, great artists really have to teach you how to read their work. And you and I were doing a radio program with Michael who's sitting in the front here recently.
For Bookworm.
Michael talked about something that is in the essay that he attributed to me, and you said, no, you had pointed that out to me. It's a page in Mouse where the swastika becomes part of the landscape that the characters are walking on. In fact, the shape of the page. And I think
now,
that,
wait, what, are you talking about the one where, that was pretty, if you couldn't see it, you'd be blind. The one where they were trying to figure out which way to go?
right, no, the one where
The one where I'm sitting on a pile of bodies? Which page are we talking? I'm sorry.
the one where it's more subtle, but it's there. It's sort of in the, it's when they're walking out, they're sort of being cast out of the world, and they're walking,
Uh-huh.
and they're, the crossroads that they're at is indicates a swastika. And I guess not so much the specific of that, but this idea that in, the thing that makes an exhibition like this, or to me, part of your motivation in teaching people like me to understand the history of comics and the formal language of comics, is to be able to go back and look at a work like Mouse and say, well, great, the story's compelling, but there are layers. This is a story that demands being reread many, many times, just like all great art, because it's operating on a deceptively large number of layers simultaneously. And part of the success of the work is that it's not completely foregrounding, showing off all the time. Look at all this stuff I can do.
Oh, quite the opposite. Like that
Right.
panel that you're talking about, I debated whether or not I was going to let it be in because it's so overtly symbolic. They're hiding before they get caught to be sent to the camps, and they're walking down a road, and the road has a very visible crossroad that turns it into a swastika shape. And that's almost like op-ed illustration, like that kind of overt symbolism. And I used it very sparingly. There's some places where it just seemed like I could do that, it would be right, and that was allowed to be there.
But part of what you
There's a
taught,
cartoonist who's very interesting who does it for every panel now. There's a guy who did a book called Epileptic. I'm blanking on his name in French. Was it David B? Or,
David B., yeah.
and the relation between the words and the pictures are specifically that. The pictures are almost symbolic images that implied by the caption for that particular panel. What's more difficult to see, which was more overt in the so-called formal works and breakdowns, is the way a page is hanging together as a visual element and what the parts of that are. In fact, when I turned to doing Mouse as a work, it was because I realized that the areas that I was interested in at that time, I wasn't teaching anybody how to read it. I was marginalizing myself to the point that, as marginal as most underground comics were, I was becoming one of the more obscure possible players by avoiding the sex and drugs content and moving into this area that really had to do with understanding
Drawing a
the
comic
language.
about nothing.
Basically, yeah, like that's certainly what
I don't get around much anymore,
Exactly.
and that it's definitely was not as
So there, like, I realized if I was going to keep making comics, I had to deal with narrative, and the one narrative that might be worth it, considering how much work it all was what ultimately turned out to be Mouse. But a lot of what I'd been doing in that, I don't know, I guess I can call it deconstructing some of the comics things, was now being spun in reverse to make it seamless so one could read through it without stumbling over it. And yet, for me to stay engaged, every page is a very specific graphic solution to a set of problems as a page.
well. I guess art criticism is always in the danger of explaining the joke. It's sort of you can't go there. But that is precisely what I found so interesting, and I think is important for people to, start to pull those layers apart. That within Mouse, they're like all the things that they're no longer tricks. They're actually in the service of something larger, and I think that's why that piece, the work resonated and it's lasted so well.
Well, I think the meanest thing I said recently about somebody I like was about Marjane Satrapi's work, a book called Persepolis that she said, like, she apologizes that everybody compares it to Mouse, but that she was definitely turned into a cartoonist as a result of seeing Mouse. And I think the meanest thing I said was that, yeah, if I did it the way you did it, it wouldn't have taken me 13 years, that, because what she has is a great quality, and it really is. It's not like she's a great cartoonist in the sense of really digging deep into what comics can be or having a very fluid hand. What she is she's an incredibly good storyteller. That whether she tells the stories on a stage and talks them, or as she's doing now, making an animated film based on Persepolis that she's controlling, she's got a compelling attitude and voice and is clear enough to be able to pull you through that. And she's learning how to cartoon as she goes along, but it's a whole other kind of work than that reinvestment.
So what are you working on now?
Well, the 50-page introduction to a 40-page book, basically.
What page are you at?
I'm not sure, because I'm not working in page units. That's
yeah,
the,
no, that was the interesting thing
Yeah.
that you were describing.
See, I mean, one thing that happened to me in the last few years was this Shadow of No Towers thing that came out. Because I really wasn't working for... When I did Mouse, I didn't think it would be that successful or popular. I just thought that, man, after I'm dead, they'll see how good this thing was, you know? Like, it was really working with a notion of posterity. And the pages that were about September 11th were not made that way at all. They were really made while I was still engaged in fear and trembling, living downtown, breathing the toxins in that make this look like kid stuff, and basically thought that, well, another kind of terrorist event is going to happen immediately, and I just got to like decide what we're going to do. And one thing I decided is we aren't leaving New York City. This is what home means and what civilization means, and I'm not going to run from it. But in that situation, I decided that I'd wasted a lot of time not making comics, avoiding it, because I've been out running this 500-pound mouse as best I can ever since it was published. And in returning to comics, I was just figuring I'll make one page. I'll just make stuff about what I'm going through now. And in the course of doing that, I allowed what you just described as me not knowing who I was when I woke up in the morning, which way I would draw, to be part of the subject matter. That, if anything, September 11th had left me shattered. I would just work in small units, and whatever happened, I would find ways to make the page. And the page was a unified element eventually, but made out of discrete bits, each drawn a different way. It liberated me because it opened me back up to the kinds of things I was thinking of when I was making breakdowns, where I wasn't as concerned about connecting all the dots for people, because time is short. So I was able to make just little flashes of thought that would be connected by the reader. And that opened up a way for me to do what I'm doing now. And it was an idea I'd had back when I was making those comic strips for breakdowns, which is, I'd mentioned hanging out with these filmmakers. I was so envious of what their working method was, which is filmmakers get to shoot a lot of crap and then find the good stuff and cut it out and paste it together. They can edit. And in comics are notoriously difficult to edit. By the time you've constructed a page, you take out one brick and the whole edifice collapses, and you have to see what you can do with the remaining bricks. So what I had as a notion then was, instead of working in page units, I would just work in same-size panels, shoot footage, let's say, and then edit it later, put the panels in order later. And I tried it once in about 1974 or 75, but I just wasn't able to do it. I did about 15 boxes, and you can't really edit when you only have 15 boxes. So now at least I'm a little bit more disciplined, and I must have made about, I don't know, by now 200 or 300 boxes and still going strong. And the goal will be to put something together, make it a page as best it can, but allow it to be constructed by little episodic flashes of memory that are interrupted by some kind of meta-commentary on occasion, and different drawing styles, different layers of thought, and see how that all comes together, and it'll function as a rather elliptical introduction to the other works.
Well, Chris Ware had a great comment in an email he sent to me recently. He was talking about the show, and he said, well, the show really proved that comics are not art, but some cartoonists are artists. And
I wonder which ones he meant.
And I certainly, over time, I've learned from you, and I think you've discussed it well this evening, of just what goes into making a comic.
I mean, it's just as true of painters, right? I mean, it's no different. I mean, all that is like a place where you can have Walter Keane paintings or David Sally paintings, or Cézanne's,
exactly.
you know.
In the history, could you just comment on Walt Kelly's place?
Well, yeah, in the expanded Masters show, I think he probably belongs in this exhibit. I think Walt Kelly, who did this comic strip Pogo, was an example of how ephemeral this art form is. Because at one point, Walt Kelly, like Al Capp, was ubiquitous. Like everybody knew who this was. And now it's sort of like a footnote to somebody very interested in comics, you know, like a fan. And I think Kelly maybe had the misfortune of having been schooled by Walt Disney, like he worked for Disney, and as a result developed a very sweet surface to the work that doesn't make it that easy to find how acidic it is at its in its discourse and at its core. He's somebody who has a great facility for drawing, but drew in that cute style. I mean, when he was working for Disney, he was responsible for the sequence in Fantasia where the two cherubs bend over and their butts become hearts, you know? That's his schooling. And on the other hand, his language is very, very, he's almost too clever by half. He's very, very verbally gifted, like these kind of parodic poems, the dialect that comes through, the quips. If anybody still knows him, these, whatever, 20 or 30 years after his heyday, it's for we have met the enemy and they are us, you know? And yet, sure, there's a lot there. And I think he is an influence on certain cartoonists even now, like Jeff Smith, who did a book called Bone, and whatever, but it's somebody whose work needs to be gathered, re-examined, and looked at one more time. And I think this show makes that kind of thing more likely to happen.
One thing that I found really interesting is in doing publicity and talking about the show, his name has come up more than any other individual, which I never would have expected. People keep asking me, what about Walt Kelly? I mean,
Maybe it's
certainly
because we're just living through such a grim moment. We want, like, more liberal commentators, you know?
That's for sure. Are we calling
I think,
James?
no, there's a microphone running
I think there's
around.
an official
Good evening.
arbitrator.
I've only seen this half of the show. I haven't been downtown. But I felt a tremendous sense of joy in these artists who are outsider artists coming from immigrant parents or themselves immigrants. And I think that's my favorite part because comic books reaches people who have not been reached. Do you want to comment on that?
I'm just trying to think if they're immigrants or children of immigrants. I think the comic strip half of the show has a little bit of that, but only a little. When you get to the Mocha half of the show, then you're talking about Jewish rag trade immigrant culture with the comic book artists. I would think that what is true is that all of these artists took themselves and their work quite seriously. None of them thought of themselves as artists. And that's where you're hitting at this outsider aspect, in the sense that their job wasn't to be artists any more than it was Alfred Hitchcock's job to be an artist. He was just, you know, getting people to buy popcorn. And these people were like trying to make sure you'd pick up the paper regularly. And it's only like, that's why I like the fact that these shows are in some kind of conversation with each other, because it's really when you start seeing what happens when you have contemporary cartoonists who are no longer in service to the mass media need of cartooning. Like, I don't think Crumb was thinking about that sort of thing when he was working. That you go back and start looking at what the voice was in these comic strips. For me, all of my art education came from these so-called outsider artists. My aesthetic was thoroughly formed by looking at comic strips and seeing that, unlike a lot of mass media like advertising or television or even most movies where they had to invent an auteur theory to make it into an art, where you had to figure out somebody's got to be responsible because if there's no artist, there can't be art. These comic strip artists, most of them, wrote and drew their own work. So there's a real voice. You're really in communication with somebody. And so there is a real personal connection that you have to Charles Schulz, even if you don't know his name and you're just interested in Charlie Brown and Snoopy. One parenthesis, though, is somebody's now making a book called Visionary Cartoonists, and it's about outsider comics artists. A guy named Dan Nadell is doing a book for, I think, Abrams. These guys are really outsiders because they're assuming that the other cartoonists are insiders.
See, that's what I was going to say. I actually think these are insider artists. And we have a very strange bias in America that's heavily colored by European hierarchies. These were, a lot of these people in the show that's in the Hammer, wildly successful people in American culture, financially, artistically. They had probably a bigger mass audience than any other medium at the time. And even more importantly, part of what we've been talking about and the whole idea of the show is to really show that these artists are talking to each other across time. And to me, one of the definitions of outsider artists are literally people that aren't coming out of a tradition, aren't working off of prior artists in a kind of apprentice tradition. And I think what you see upstairs is, to some degree, a succession, not a literal one, but you have, E.C. Seeger and Popeye learning from George Harriman. You have Frank King learning from Winsor McKay. I think it's a real artisanal studio tradition, not unlike, clusters of, European art in the Renaissance. And I think it's been so hard to accept these people as insider artists, just because in America we almost have like a problem with our own culture.
Actually, if we can quote Chris Ware again, the best thing that he said that I can remember was, he says, when a painter does something you can't understand, you think you're stupid. When you read a comic you can't understand, you think the cartoonist is stupid. And that's the main distinction. So what I did do is, before this show went up, I went onto eBay to try to get some stuff, figuring, oh man, this is going to make it so I can't afford it anymore.
In fact, that's happened.
It's happened that I can't afford some of this
Well,
stuff anymore.
the eBay market has, it's
Shot
the same thing.
up. Oh, really?
Chris was, the one artist here that I never really understood before, and this show really convinced me, was Chester Gould. Mm-hmm. And then I noticed that Chris was, being outbid on Chester Gould's in eBay, every week. So, what are you going to do?
I'm just curious about the way these things turn out to be comic books or art, if there ever was a distinction. If you think of the case of Henry Darger, he's no more a cartoonist than he is an artist, but somehow they found him and threw him on the walls of a museum rather than putting him on newsprint. So he became an artist. And I sometimes wonder whether, if it weren't for those underground comics and their flowering, whether your work art, for instance, might have gone into galleries first rather than into comic books. How did these distinctions between what shows up in a museum and what shows up on pieces of paper get made?
Well, I think that when you say underground comics, that's the place where the history took a radical shift. Because up to that point, comics really, Darger couldn't have been syndicated by King Features. They would have had a real problem with these little dingly male genitals on those sisters.
But he could have been in Zap Comics.
He could have been in Zap.
He was in Raw.
He could have been, yes, he was in Raw before he was as widely known as he's become since, but after his death. But I think that underground comics, that's what I'm saying, is the distinction falls apart. At that point, which art ends up on a wall, which ends up on a page, is luck of the draw for certain kinds of art. Like Gary Panter has always considered himself an artiste, like in the sense of like making things that would look right on a wall. And one is convinced when one goes to the MoCA that unlike certain artists that are hanging in these museums, his work is made and inhabits and dominates that space like any painting might. My work is really the detritus of something that was on its way to becoming a printed work. I'm not as interested in originals. Gary's very aware of the plastic thing that he's working with, but it really is, at that point, not a big distinction, except a successful painter tends to make a lot more than a successful worker on newsprint.
But I think really where that distinction is important is in the preservation and the archival attention to the work. And one of the things in doing the research for the show that really struck me was a lot of this history could have been completely lost to us. And then there were really one or two individuals like Rick Marshall and Bill Blackbeard who collected runs of these printed newspaper pages. Most of the originals that these artists made were routinely thrown away. I mean, there's decades of Chester Gould's original work that doesn't exist because they were reprinted later in Harvey Comics and they cut up the Sunday pages to make them fit into the comic book form, and then just threw them away. I have a friend who worked there in that era, and he's like, gee, I guess I should have kept some of them.
Well, one of the artists that would be nice to have seen in the show also is Jack Cole, Plastic Man. There were almost no examples of his great work. There's some of his Playboy cartoon art that Hefner held on to. But when he was a comic book artist, they were consciously destroyed. They were shredded so that they couldn't be reprinted without copyright permission. So that was just totally destroyed. So showing his work means showing printed work. And maybe this is another aspect of the same conversation of who ends up where. The thing that is the most difficult to demonstrate in this kind of show is the narrative element of the work. One's constantly reading fragments, you know, and it's very difficult to deal with the two components that by definition are what make up comics. One half dominates what's on these walls. You get to have, at best, like 4 dailies in a row or something, or 4 Sunday printed pages in a vitrine, and one doesn't get the full breadth of the work that way. It becomes almost like an accident that they're beautiful, you know?
Since I have a microphone in my hand, there'll be more of John Carlin and Art Spiegelman on Thursday on KCRW on Bookworm at
Ever the
2:30.
opportunity.
I was like, you're a ringer. You're a professional
I was made for
questioner.
this. I think we have time for just a couple more questions.
Stand up. Oh, me too. After Mouse, you did The Wild Party. Was that the book you did
Yeah.
directly after that? And I was wondering if you could talk about what it was like to go from such an intensely personal book to, I guess, essentially an adaptation of some.
Well, yeah, the main reason I did The Wild Party was I wanted to find the anti-mouse. I mean, it's been like actually a very big part of my life since Mouse has been finding like how to get out from under the shadow of a work that was that successful, you know. And in Mouse, very specifically, there was no room for the sensual. There was no room for craft and for that kind of thing. There was I had to suppress certain kinds of graphic qualities. And so this was something I'd wanted to do for a long time, the Wild Party thing, but it never had any real pressing urgency. But it seemed great to be able to draw naked ladies after doing Mouse, you know, that weren't on a pile of bodies. So that was what it was. Of course, I managed to turn it into, like everything in my life, I managed to take these things that were meant to make me happy and turn them into nightmares. Like by having chosen to do the Wild Party as scratchboard drawings, it became so labor intensive that by the time I was finished, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew it wasn't anything else ever again on scratchboard, you know?
Just to follow up some comments that you guys made tonight, in terms of the difference between wall art
Oh.
and narrative art. I think that one of the aspects of comics which are so wonderful is that it's intimacy, and I think that is a very different thing than having paper in front of one, you know, and having a relationship of one-to-one with that, and having something on a wall, you know, where either one's in public, you know, or even in private, where you're focusing on an object, you know. And I think that it's also one of the great things about what a painting, you know, or a still work can do, is it really, you know, can capture an essence of a moment, and you can lose yourself in that time and again. But comics do something very different, and you know, this paradox of how to make comics be appreciated as a so-called serious art, you know, has confounded me my whole life, you know. And I think this show is very interesting in that I think it's made, you know, taken many steps towards that. But I don't think it's a competition, and I don't think that it ever can replace, you know, a great painting. But it does what it does, as you know, you've pointed out, and as Scott McCloud points out, you know, it does what it does in a way that nothing else can do.
Yeah,
So-
and I find that even though I seriously have never thought about my originals as frameable wall art. I mean, you can see it when you go through it. It's like on scraps of paper, some of it. It's got all kinds of ugly paste-ups and whatever, because it was always just part of, it was like chopping the block of wood that you then take an impression from. And yet, that being said, I have, as I answered earlier, a bunch of comics originals on the walls. I love to look at them, and they have their own quality that echoes what happens with paintings when you live with something and look at it over and over again. They change with repeated viewing. On the other hand, my main impulse, my main interest has been in the printed object, where every printed copy is an original, which is a road to heartbreak, because printing just has too many things going wrong all the time. But nevertheless, I find myself wistful now for even the originals I used to make, because more and more there's less and less. I've like totally embraced the fact that all of this stuff has to be digitalized to be turned into a printed object, and anything that helps me get to that finish line is fine. And so my originals are more and more prone to be retouched into whole other drawings. Sometimes I've made drawings that don't even touch paper, that I'm drawing on screen, and it's been I think a rather noble thing of me to ignore the market for original artwork, but just keep my eye on the ball, which is trying to make something that'll work. And as a result, the computer's just become the most expensive whiteout I ever bought. Sometimes. I'm not sure if it's the subtlety or the scale, but I know that some things are just like magic because they have that aura of the original object. To see the Mad cover that changed my life, the one that has Basil Wolverton's head on what looks like a Life magazine cover, as a piece of artwork, you know, there's other paintings that look a lot kind of classier. But this has like that aura of like, my God, that's the thing that changed my life, and that's the one that they sent to the printer. My God, you know.
But I think part of what makes this interesting is framing the question that way, because part of it for me is, well, what's the purpose of a museum? It's like we're implying that a museum means a certain thing, or that an art object is a certain thing. Those are historically determined. You know, the museum is a fairly recent phenomenon. It's essentially a bourgeois capitalist phenomenon where the privilege of the art object moves out of the churches and the, you know, aristocracy's homes into this, you know, public display, which is often done to manifest the wealth and the power of the culture doing the displaying. So what is a museum? I mean, is the museum the thing that we want to preserve? What I alluded to before, I mean, to me, putting comics in the museum helps the preservation. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether they're art or, you know, what is art? That's a bigger question. But it really means that it gets a kind of it looked at in a certain way within society that allows for its preservation so that people in the future can make the right decisions for them. That one thing I learned by studying art history is every culture thinks that it understands what's of value within its own culture and is typically wrong in terms of what future generations find of interest. And that's kind of what drove me to comics in the first place, was really saying, you know, this crumb stuff really feels like the best expression of what went on in the 60s. Like, I love fine art. I love Andy Warhol. I love Rosenquist. I love all the stuff that happened in the 60s. But if you really want to know what it felt like, what people looked like, what they dressed, the emotional life of Americans, well, that's where you find it. Now, gee, it's not in a object that looks great in a wall, but maybe we have to redefine our definitions because of that for our own needs as, you know, early 21st century Americans. Like, we live in our own culture. You know, what is it? What is the great? So to me, this is part of like, what is the great art of America? It's all vernacular. It's the thing that knocked me out when I'm doing the show and I'm looking at Winsor McCay. You look at what's going on in the fine art world at the same time as McKay's doing his work. It's really pretty amazing if you compare him to Robert Henry or John Sloan or the things that are going around. He seems so advanced in that context. You know, he's really anticipating things, and not so much anticipating it from an art perspective, which I think ultimately is limited. He's actually reflecting what's going on in the society at that time, the machines, the buildings, the speed. You know, the essential invention of animation in his comic strips and his animated cartoons, you know, it tells you more than a technical innovation. It really is like, this is what people in the culture wanted at that moment. And that's what I think ultimately is so valuable about comics. Putting them in a museum and having a serious discussion around them, that just means that there are more discussions. And the rag pickers of history, you know, this is one of the things that they can look to And, you know,
For me, this
find
show
value.
is a way of having gotten the notary seal on the Faustian deal that was involved in doing this work, you know? Because basically what this is you get them into universities, you get them into the real bookstores rather than the pre-adolescent version of porn shops, which is what most comic shops in America still are. You get them into real bookstores, you get them into universities, and you get them into museums, and then you have the cultural imprimatur that allows another generation of comics artists to exist and say, screw that, I just want it to be more related to graffiti than to anything that's happening in the art world. No, graffiti is, well, you know what I mean. And that, but for that even counteraction, the rebellion, the insistence on the pleasures of the vulgarity of comics to be able to move forward, you have to have people still making it. And the economic engine got kind of the wind knocked out of its sails. Comic strips were the most popular form of culture at the moment that they were in their heyday. Comic books were read by millions and millions. At this point, most comic books had been reduced to being marketing tests for underoos or movies. And the real stuff of comics, in order for it to stay alive, has had to move into the more rarefied zones that the so-called literary novel has had to move into to continue existing.
But at the same time, and this is where cartoons are the ultimate insiders in a way, and you alluded to, is it fuels our culture. We're at a moment where the cultural product of Los Angeles and America are, you know, digital constructions, which are basically like plastic inventions that are created by teams or individuals.
Right.
And
So for those of you missing the State of the Union, I can say our nation is totally fucked, but comics are really doing great these days.
I don't think you can go on after that. I think
It's a pretty good place to stop. Why don't we end there? Thank you.